in downtown Kalamazoo, Michigan. And then Chris is joining us in place of John Benedict, who couldn't be with us today. And finally, we have Lee Cox, who is the Vice President of Global Marketing and Sales at Hoka One One. Lee, can you wave? All right. So please drop questions and comments throughout. There are a lot of us in here, so it may scroll by far quicker than I can pull into the conversation, but it is my goal, my intention to pull in as much as I can. I want to start by giving the floor to Dr. Smith, Laura, and let's start with defining some terms, because I think what's most difficult, honestly, is that when we're talking about these issues, we often aren't even talking about the same thing. So I'm going to hand the floor to you with that question. Please start there for us.
Great, and thank you for having me, Allison. It's such a thrill to be associated with like a whole big group of role models for me. I know that in some ways talking to this group is a little bit preaching to the choir, but yeah, just as you said, it's important to kind of delineate some of the terminology that we use when we talk about race and racism, because although there is no one right or wrong way that's carved in stone, it helps to have a place to start, right? And we know that when we have a group of people coming together like this, doubtless there are some people that are coming to the group having had lots of previous experience, lots of previous readings and classwork and conversations and lived experience that prepares them at like a different level from other people that may just be starting out in being involved in this work. So it's nice to just have a chance to get on the same page, given that like the language is so changeable and unclear most of the time.
Yeah.
So what I often do is kind of start out by distinguishing race from some other closely related terms. And that it's almost like by pulling out what the other terms are, you're kind of left in a clearer place to understand what we're talking about with regard to race. And the first one that I think of often is nationality. I mean, nationality is something that clearly isn't race, but it's kind of like its next door neighbor in a certain way. It's one of its many next door neighbors. And when you think of a person's nationality, like when you know somebody's nationality, what do you know about them? Like, what does that say to you about who the person is in terms of their sociocultural identity? Mm-hmm. What people will often say in response to that question when I ask is, and I did a conversation with a group on this just a couple of days ago, is, oh, you know, it comes from the word nation. So often it tells you something about where they live, of what country they're a citizen, maybe where they were born. Nationality tells you something about who they are with regard to sort of a nation or a state or a geographic location, people will often say. So there's that piece of who somebody is that we can kind of set to one side now. Okay, that part of our identity is closely related to, but not the same as, of course, ethnicity, somebody's ethnicity. So when we use that word, when we know somebody's ethnicity, something much broader comes to mind, right? People will often mention things like, you know, language or culture or cooking or food or music, a part of a person's heritage, a lot more about the way people live together and sort of what the traditions have been in their families is sort of associated with their ethnicity. So people might be really connected to, say, an ethnic heritage that's Italian, and they still might sort of have the big Sunday lunches or dinners with the whole family that was traditional for generations back. People might celebrate their Irish ethnic heritage and do St. Patrick's Day events. Often, you know, we mentioned the word religion just now in association with ethnicity. there's an ethnic tradition that includes both sort of cultural and historical and also religious or spiritual elements, like being Jewish. People who are Jewish have a religious sort of commonality to their ethnicity. They may be more or less observant, but there's a religious component to being Jewish. But there's also a historical and a social tradition, and a tradition of food and music and literature and language and all of the above. So nationality, right? We're putting that over here. Ethnicity tells us a lot more about a person. But now that we've kind of delineated those, and they do have some overlap, what is race, right? Like what is race? And I would be happy for people to popcorn something out, or maybe I'll peek over here at my other laptop that has the chat up on it. What do you think of when you contemplate the term race? What does knowing somebody's race tell you about them? And what I can tell you, as I'm keeping an eye on the chat, is that some of the things that people often say at this point is, at first, maybe nothing for a few minutes. And then maybe they'll mention skin color, genetics, says somebody, right? There's like a, the sense of a physiological component to race, given that skin color is certainly one of its markers. And let me just broaden skin color out to use the word phenotype, which a lot of people might know. When you are assigning people to a racial group, when people get assigned to a racial category based on the way they look, that's called based on phenotype. Phenotype just means all the visible things that you can see about a person, including their skin color. It can correlate to cultural practices, yes, indeed. It's a social construct, says someone. Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the points at which it kind of becomes a little like, oh, is it biological or is it a social construct? Or how can we have both of those at the same time? And of course, both of them are inherent in what we mean when we talk about race, because race is a social category built up around phenotype, right? People get assigned to a racial category based on the way they look. But that's not the most meaningful part of what race is. It's an essential part of it. But what happens then with those categories? A whole system of privilege and oppression got built up around them, right? Since the earliest days of this nation's founding. So, you know, sometimes people will kind of respond to the notion of race understandably by saying, oh, but it's just skin color. Oh, it's just appearance. That doesn't mean anything. So why should we, those are superficial characteristics. Why should we be so concerned with race? And the concern with race is that that's where it starts, but that's not, indeed, those people are right, the most important part. It's the whole social, historical, political, cultural, economic system of privilege and oppression that got built up around people's assignments to those categories. As being white, if they had one particular kind of phenotype, or as being other, as being something else, as being a person of color, as being Black, because they didn't get racialized according to those categories. Now, you notice how I keep mentioning people getting racialized. That's because in a racialized society, people get raced whether or not that assignment matches up with the inside story of them, right? So there's kind of like a both and piece here. Sometimes people will have a story of who they are that's different from the way they're getting raced in our society. And this is something that maybe you've kind of wondered about yourself, or you've heard something like this come up in conversations with other people. I certainly see it in teaching, Alison, and you may have even seen it yourself when you were in all of our classes back in the day. For example, one of the things about learning what race is that is uncomfortable for white people is that they are learning for maybe the first time how much harm has been associated with racialization to people of color. And one of the things that you sort of, in a very human way, feel impelled to do when you learn all that is to kind of feel like, I don't want anything to do with all that stuff. And so we'll have people, I've had a number of white students in my classes when we talked about racial identity, explain to the class that they didn't identify as white, although they looked 100% white, but they identified, for example, one woman explained to us that she identified as Mediterranean, that her family came from some of the countries around the Mediterranean Sea, Greece, Italian, and Italians were not raised as white in the early days of this country, and she didn't identify as white either. And so you can begin to see how she was telling us about the inside story of herself and her awareness of her family's kind of ethnic traditions as Italian Americans, and how that was part of who she is and how she felt about how she would like to be viewed by others. And those things are real. Our inside stories of who we are and our valuing of our family's ethnic heritage is real. At the very same time, if my Mediterranean student goes out to the corner to hail a taxi and Allison goes out to the corner and hails a taxi, 9 times out of 10, the taxi is going to pass by Allison and pick up the Mediterranean student. Who's the security guard going to follow around when they enter, when they go shopping at Saks here in New York? The security guard is probably not going to, 9 times out of 10, there's always exceptions, is probably not usually going to follow the woman who's identifying as Mediterranean. Does that start to make sense? That both, it's a both and. The inside story of who we are matters, but that's not what race is. Race happens to you separate from that. And if you're white, you're getting lifted up and advantaged and benefited from it all the time, no matter how much you feel personally against it and you don't identify with it. And if you're a person of color, you're getting disadvantaged by it and oppressed, right? Pressed down, and harmed by it all the time, regardless of how you feel about yourself inside. And that's one of the reasons why we also use the words white and black to talk about race, as opposed to Irish American or even African American to talk about ethnicity. Because being black includes lots of people who don't identify as African American. They identify as Caribbean. They might be Africans. They identify as Afro-Latina. But they all share the phenotypical characteristics that are causing the security guard 9 times out of 10 to follow them around, right? They share the phenotype that causes them to experience that systematic or structural oppression that goes by the name of one of the isms, right, which is racism. And throwing the word systematic or structural in there, like lots of you probably know that's just a way of denoting the fact that the isms, oppression, forms of oppression, also heterosexism, sexism, classism, the isms aren't just individual exchanges between people. The isms are multifaceted, far-flung and historic ways that a whole society operates so as to systematically lift up one group at the expense of somebody else. So when you say that something's structural, right, you're just kind of saying it's baked all the way through the cake, so that the way that our educational systems work tends to advantage white people, white students, as it oppresses students of color. The way that the court system works tends to advantage white people as it oppresses people of color. The way that media representations operate tends to portray white people in a way that advantages them, and the contrary for people of color. Always, but not without exception. There's always exceptions, and often people will volunteer them during a conversation. Yes, indeed, there are always exceptions. The problem is that I mean, we're happy about the exceptions when they happen, right? And we're happy when people succeed despite the odds. When somebody who grew up in poverty beats the odds and succeeds at the highest levels, we celebrate those stories. The problem is still the odds. You know, when they're exceptions, it's like still a problem. That's why we need to talk about structures and systems of oppression, even though there are exceptions, and we celebrate the exceptions. So yeah, that's a little bit about how I think about those terms. You know, one of the occupational hazards of being a professor is like, you can talk, man, you can go. You know, my dad was a professor too, and my stepmother used to say, if you ask him what time it is, he'll tell you the history of clocks. So let me stop on the history of clocks and see where we want to go next, Alison.
Laura, I love it. I feel like you drop the mic. I really enjoy these conversations because I think that, you know, as I said, we're encountering this every day, but we don't all have the language or the deep understanding. And part of our work here is getting folks caught up and getting on the same page with language, right? So please let's all be like very humble in what we understand and don't understand. I want to now bring Chris and Lee into the conversation because I want to talk about, you know, we have this idea, and by we, I'm saying here as Americans, we have this idea that the professional and the personal are separate, and therefore emotions don't belong in business. And you know, me being a intersectional feminist, that has never been my understanding of the world, right? But I wanna talk, and I'll start with you, Lee, if you don't mind. If you could talk about your journey in being able to recognize your whiteness and this sort of overlap of the personal, emotional, professional, all of that.
Yeah, it goes a long ways back, but I think the personal and business is a good place to start. And we talked about this recently, because you can no longer separate it. You know, I think the industry that I've been in for the past 25 years, it's a predominantly white industry. You know, I was, you know, dime a dozen, white distance runner, male, got hired by a brand. And whether it was intentional or not intentional, it's what happened. And it is a form of systematic oppression, however you want to view it. Had many friends of various races and backgrounds, et cetera, but they didn't find their way into the industry. So I began to ask myself that, and also I'm in a biracial family. So, you know, I started to look and, you know, really ask myself personal questions about why do I not see representation amongst the industry? And you know, this sat in the back of my mind for a long time. And as I entered into leadership, I partook in referral hiring and, you know, the easy hire. I know so-and-so, they ran this fast. I participated in that exact same practice. And I think once, you know, really in the last 5 years with, you know, when joining HOCA, it was something we talked a lot about being an inclusive brand and being an inclusive organization. And then I really began to become self-reflective, like, wow, I really have participated in unintentionally, not with any kind of malice, but I also participated. It was a real self-reflection as we started to hire and bring more people into the organization and having honest conversations amongst our leadership team that we're not doing a good enough job here. And, you know, the personal expression at work, you know, at Deckers, one of the things that we pride ourselves is bring your best self, bring who you are, be honest about who you are. And I think in order to do that, you can't separate personal and business. You can't be someone at work and be someone different at home. So I'm kind of like going through the journey really fast here, but it really starts with an honest question of oneself, and honestly asking oneself, you know, what are my personal biases? What are the things that are not enabling me to hire inclusivity, hire diversity? It's a real honest conversation personally. And I think once you can do that, and I'm still on that journey myself, by far not perfect, but I think once you do that, it really opens up the perspective, your mind, to what possibly can be done, and not, using an excuse or, being a little bit, taking the easy way to get someone hired because you need to hire someone fast. So I think there are a lot of, it opens up a lot of challenging conversations. But the personal side in business, because of the importance of diversity in the workplace and the lives that we live, you can't separate it. If you truly are going to be an honest leader and as much as you can, an unbiased leader, you have to bring your personal self in order to be your best professional self. And I think that's a really difficult thing to do, because then you get into business objectives and et cetera. It obviously is very complex, but that's the journey we're on. So that's my really quick summary. And it's something we talk a lot about. It's credit to, the organization, that it's a very open topic. And, many amongst our team are in very, very different places and weren't aware. I wasn't aware of a lot of things, but those conversations happen. And you've just got to provide a really safe place for people to have those conversations without judgment, regardless of where you are. That's why personal and business really can't be separated anymore.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lee, for your honesty there, because I think, again, just to sort of normalize what we're hoping to accomplish with the coalition, is that we have to recognize that we all become aware at different times. And there's no better time than when that happens to get into this work, right? And so particularly as white industry leaders, I think you're modeling that part. Chris, I want to bring you into the conversation. And I know for you, you've been, this is the ultra marathon with no medals, but you've been going at a 5-minute pace. Tell us how you find yourself in this self-reflective process.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I do want to apologize that I'm not John Benedict. As many people in this circle know him as JB. I'm a 5,000, 10,000 meter, runner. He was a 400 meter hurdler. He's badass. I mean, I'm just not badass like him. But anyways, I come to this knowing that it was personally yanked out of me to take action instead of having race and racism and inclusion of race and racism in our business, Gazelle Sports, as part of a strategy. So we do strategic plans every year, as most people around the business world do. And this strategic plan sets our priorities. And I think that we all can, as business men and women, can say, we can hide behind that, because strategies are like, how are we going to succeed this year? And so it is a very much a business decision, that what are our priorities and how are we going to align? And the decision to stop and talk about racism is really, as Lee said, and you're indicating, it's a personal thing first. It can't be, we're going to do this strategically. It just doesn't, I mean, there's strategy, sure, but it has to be personal first. And so for me, talking about it strategically versus talking about it personally changed with Ahmaud Arbery's murder. And I just, knowing about it, reading about it, diving into it, just ripped me apart personally in a way that emotionally was very difficult. Every time I read something about him, I just would be crying, because I could understand what he was doing, running. I self-identified with him. I identified as a parent of him. And so as a white person, I had not done that before. And so that was a moment saying, I have to do more. So that was my personalization. And then it was, okay, I know this, but what am I going to do about it? And the what are you going to do about it is extremely uncomfortable, and it's very and it's you start talking with your friends, who my friends are white. The people that own running retail stores are almost all white, probably 99%. And so we started talking, and that is just a echo chamber of whiteness, right? And so these words that, Laura's speaking, and things like structural or systemic racism, those words start hurting people, especially white supremacy. White supremacy is something that, we don't want to be associated with it because of what the media says about it. And again, that's a personal thing, and that is a hard thing for white people to deal with. These words that become like, you're attacking me, I don't feel comfortable. But why I am willing to be uncomfortable is, number one, it's time to be uncomfortable. But number two is I have to say just some work personally with the Dare to Lead concepts with Brene Brown, that it's like, get in the arena, take your armor off, and be willing to get your ass kicked. And that's going to be okay, because you have to get to vulnerability before you're going to make any change. So that's where I'm at right now. Still definitely in an early stage of understanding what I need to do here as a leader, what I need to do in my community, what I need to do in my business.
Thank you, Chris, and I appreciate that. Laura, I want to go to you now for some context here, because we're talking about how deeply personal this is. And so how do we then move from the personal to like the policy, the structural, like the power piece? And then another question is just like the good bad binary that we often hear, right? Like that good people are not racist, are not part of white supremacy. Bad people are. So two questions. The first around this personal to then the shifting power.
And I think maybe I'll respond to them in the opposite order, because I think they actually do. I mean, I'm sure you put them together because they go well together. Yeah.
Yep.
So the good bad binary. Yeah. If only the main reason that we still have racism were that the KKK still exists, there are white nationalists out there, and there are neo-Nazis out there. The thing that happens when you define racism by those bad actors and their actions is that we actually end up neglecting to address the space in which the space that is probably most responsible for the fact that racism persists, which is the spaces of taken for granted whiteness that all of us participate in maintaining, unless we're doing something to the contrary. Because the status quo is characterized by whiteness and racism, and just the way we were talking, because it's kind of baked into the whole like fabric of things, because the status quo is characterized by racism and whiteness, unless you're taking deliberate action to the contrary, you're participating in maintaining it, right? Like there isn't any neutral place to sit. All the status quo requires of us to keep rolling along to the next generation is that we just do nothing. Business as usual. We just don't look at it. And if you see it out of the corner of your eye, just don't mention it, look somewhere else. And on it will go. And the kids of everybody on this call will have the same racist world that we had, if only we will just say nothing. And that's the danger of the good bad binary. It's not enough to shut down the bad actors, although we must. It's certainly valuable to identify them and do whatever we can to stop their actions. We also have to look at the questions of white spaces. And that's, of course, why your whole group exists, because running is one of those sort of activities and also industries that became just kind of a taken for granted white space. But of course, it's far from the only one. But the idea of white spaces is what, for example, makes it so dangerous for people of color to do something like linger for too long in the Starbucks, right? You're not expected to be there. It's what made it dangerous for, you know, a black bird watcher in the park here where I live to ask a white woman to follow the instructions on the sign and leash her dog, right? So those are the spaces, that's the danger of the good bad binary, that we allow our attention to be deflected away from the real problem, and which is the harder problem to address. And remind me again of the wording of the first question. It was about conversations.
It was about like going from the personal to then the,
Yeah. So part of how you do that is just by what you're doing today. And you know this, like we chatted about this before, but I'll just mention to everyone on the call. I think the idea of having conversations, of having dialogues is so important. Sometimes having dialogues gets diminished as like, oh, that's just talking, you know, when are we going to do something? Just talking is not nothing. When there's a real give and take, and when we, and of course this is true for white people because we're so often not in dialogue about race and racism, when we require of ourselves to, in the moment, respond to what we're hearing, dig deep, and come up with a response and sit with the feelings that happen when we don't really know what the answer is, and be willing to interrogate all that and be willing to go forward anyway. So everything that Chris and Lee were talking about that they're doing, like, oh, I'm going to be vulnerable. Oh, I'm going to take the risk. Oh, I'm going to be out there. That is so important for us as white people to move to action, is to move into that space of contemplating action and taking action and creating action, and not only hiring presenters to come in and deliver answers to us and asking people for, like, can I have 7 steps for being a better ally? There's nothing wrong with the steps on that list. I'm sure that they're wonderful and we should all be doing them. But I hope I'm being clear about what I'm saying. You can figure some of those things out, and moving into that space where you're interrogating yourself and being in dialogue and saying, why am I waiting for somebody to tell me those answers? Why do I keep asking questions? Again, there's nothing wrong with questions. This is a both and not an either or. But why am I not also just kind of putting myself out there to interrogate things from the ground up? You know, people in business and other organizations can do that when they need to. There are times when they have to analyze and review and change corporate culture, like when technology changes, and that means you have to change everything that you do on the inside, or when there's going to be a merger that happens. Oh, this is, our identity is completely different now. We have to figure out who we are all over again. That's what this requires too, a building of an anti-racist culture. And we can do that. We can do that in just the way that Chris and Lee are talking about.
Thank you. That's such a helpful, I don't know the word, but it's a helpful way of viewing it, right? Like, companies actually can do this. Companies regularly do this. And of course, this, I'm not going to say it's no different, but this is that same thing, right? This is the same way we would adapt to all being on Zoom right now. We can all adapt and find the way to be anti-racist. Lee, I want to go to you, and I want to talk about something specifically that we discussed, and about how the case study of Deckers and Black Lives Matter, and, you know, in these moments when things happen in the industry, what is the role of white leaders to address white supremacy, to speak out on issues of systemic racism? If you could take us through that case study as one of the examples.
Yeah, I think if you go back to, you know, Black Lives Matter becoming a big movement. Obviously, it's been around much longer than the last 7 or 8 months. But, you know, when Ahmaud and when the atrocities were happening, it became a big topic of discussion at Deckers. And, you know, I think when brands started to come out, it took a little bit of, I think Nike was one of the first brands to come out and make a big statement. And I think when the largest brands comes out and makes a statement, it definitely creates a bit of an open space for a lot of brands. I mean, they're a behemoth of a brand. but it was something that at Deckers was being discussed quite a bit, about being more diverse, being more inclusive, and then actually taking action. So, at Deckers is a few brands between UGG and Teva, Hoka, Sanuk, and all the brands were very aligned to we need to come out and make a statement, and then actually follow up on actions. So, one of the things that I think even Deckers earning report is this coming week, you'll hear our CEO Dave Powers talk pretty candidly in the earnings reports about being an anti-racist company and taking the action. So making a statement to especially when you're publicly traded, and making a statement to the street that we have a position of anti-racism, it's a big deal. I mean, that is not something that you can take lightly. And so I think having those outward type messages certainly establishes a behavior, a rhythm, a kind of mindset about how we're approaching the business. And then there's tons of internal work to be done. That by no means makes us perfect. We've got our own work to do, and becoming more inclusive, becoming more diverse, and elevating more diverse leadership, et cetera. So it. The nice thing is I think I look back my 5 years at Deckers, 5 years at Hoka, this has always been a conversation. It's never not been in, it's just more, it became obviously very elevated very quickly. And the movement kicked in. And, I think just because the fabric of how we behave and how we conduct ourselves on a day to day, it was a very natural step to make. Mm-hmm. And so that without, being able to go through every single part of the process, I don't even know if it really was a process. It was just like, it was deeply personal for everyone, and everyone had a very personal opinion about it, and everyone was very aligned to it as well. So it was more of an easier decision. The hard work is the change, being change makers, taking action, holding ourselves accountable. And I've seen some comments in the chat about communicating what is the diverse makeup of brands and organizations. And that's the work we're in, that is the hard work and honest assessment as to how do we measure ourselves to hold ourselves accountable? What's the path forward? And I think, give credit to Deckers doing a lot of good work for that, but we have a lot of work to do. And this is not going to be a quick fix. It's going to take time, but it's not going to happen fast enough either. So I think it's all these like things that are really challenging, and it's more deeply personal for others than some, and it's never going to happen fast enough for some, and for others it's like it's happening too fast. So I think even many on this call may feel like, why this is such an uncomfortable topic, and et cetera. And I think just that keywords that were already mentioned, vulnerability and being uncomfortable. I know for myself personally, and many across the organization welcome that. They welcome that uncomfortableness. They welcome that vulnerability, and we want to be change makers, and making an impact and making the world. I make the world a bit better. As you've heard me say many times. So it's just do our part, but it is going to be really hard work. It's going to be a gut check. It's going to be acknowledgement of personal bias, and we all have them, and we're all imperfect people. But how do you bring your best self, and being aware of those biases so that we can make change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Lee. I want to highlight a few things that you said there about this process being imperfect, and I personally want to acknowledge my own biases too, right? Like each of us do have them, because we are in these systems of sexism, heterosexism, right? Patriarchy. So all of that also is internalized in me, right? Though I identify as a Black woman. And then I want to go to you, Chris, and I want to talk about the same question around the importance of accountability for white industry leaders. And I want to push you a bit, because I know that you are having a lot of this conversation and doing a lot of this work. So if you could share with us some insight on where is running retail in this process.
So I think running retail is it's a fabulous business because it is a passionate business. It's people that have determined that they want to take their passion for what they do as a lifestyle into a business. And so there's all these passionate people that are in running retail and in the running brands and throughout running, because it's something we believe it empowers ourselves to feel better about ourselves. It's transformative. And so there's all of this energy around that, that says, I want to share this. I'm going to sell a lot of shoes. I'm going to sell some cool apparel, all that. That's great, but we're not transactional a business. We're a relationship-based business. And look, the relationships are white right now. They really are. In terms of the ownership, are very white. And I think that it's very difficult for us to say we're not inclusive, because the word inclusive and running retail, especially retail and in the running brands, is really part of our ethos and values. I would say almost everybody that is on this call that's a running retailer feels they're inclusive. So for us to say we're not inclusive starts feeling personal, like, oh, you're attacking me. Like, wait a minute, I am inclusive. Look at all the things I've done for this charity. Look at all the things I've done for these people that run on trails or don't look like me or whatever. But really, we have not. This has been a very much a blind spot in terms of inclusivity. The other thing is recognizing privilege. I think what Laura talked about in terms of privilege, recognizing and not acknowledging privilege is not something we're self-identifying with at all. We're not reflecting on that. So it's hard because I think a lot of small business people, which are running retail, especially retail as small businesses, we worked our butts off to get here. We're like, this is not an easy road. It's like, we've worked hard, right? So, hey, if we've worked hard, we don't have any privilege, do we? Well, yeah, you have a lot of privilege. I just had, a Zoom meeting with my banker earlier today, and I know the banks opened doors to me that would have been closed to a person of color, 35 years ago. So, so there is a lot of privilege that we have, and acknowledging that and accepting it is a step forward. But it's just not enough. And so that's why the RIDC is so important, that we're all coming together and going, we need to create traction and amplify this so that we can do better together. But why this conversation is so important is we have to take it on as white people before because BIPOC have been talking about this, we just haven't listened. So it is time for us to listen, but also to learn and take that responsibility on ourselves to learn. Not only ourselves, but our own businesses to learn, and then collaborate like we are intending to do in this coalition to really build best practices across the board, whether you're an event, whether you're a timing company, whether you're a club, whether you're a retailer, whether you're a brand. So, but first we gotta wear this, because it has been hard, and there's a lot of defensiveness up there that is, some of it's true. Well, it's unintentional. Oh, yeah, but that's bias. It's like, oh, if somebody else could have worked as hard as I did, well, no, they didn't have access. So there is all of these things that are tied in that we just have not looked at, and reflected on as much as we should have, but now we have to.
Chris, I love that, because what you bring into focus something that Laura said, is that it's not either or, it's yes and. Yes, I have privileged identities. Yes, I have marginalized identities. Yes, I have had a lot of struggle, but yes, because of certain privileges that I have had access that others haven't had, right? So when we recognize the complexity and that it's not, we're not taking away your struggle. We don't seek to take away what you've done. We just seek to widen this space. I want to direct this next question to Laura, and listen, we're running out of time, but there's follow-up to this, so stay with me, everybody. There were comments dropped around building trust, around performative allyship versus authenticity. There was a race director that said something about, how do we partner with police when a lot of the movement right now is around defunding police. And I don't expect you to have an answer to that one, but can you talk about this, the performative piece and the authenticity piece, and the demands that sometimes seem inconsistent with where our business needs to go? Like, a race does need support, but we recognize that the police are not safe for Black and Brown communities. So anything you can add there.
Well, just as you're suggesting, the issues with police and the dialogues with police are like thorny and difficult. That issue, like, yeah, it requires an investment of attempts at collaboration and learning together with them, that I don't want to trivialize it by saying something too quick about it, right? But what I will say about the performative part is this. That's a super important issue. I'm so glad that people are bringing it up. And anything can be performative or anything cannot be performative. The question is it part of a long-term commitment to bringing into being a new anti-racist culture? Is it a step, a piece of that? Maybe your first step, maybe it's small. Maybe you posted the black square on Tuesday way back in the day on Instagram, right? Maybe you just did something little, but maybe that's your first little thing. Maybe that's your first little thing that's part of a lifelong commitment that you're then going to develop. On the other hand, when people are just doing short-term kinds of actions, now are y'all still hearing me?
Yeah, you're there.
Okay, good. I'm just like seeing something that on my screen that made me think that you weren't. Yeah. On the other hand, short-term actions, one-offs, PR kinds of things that are meant to serve as impression management or to move products, and everybody sees that it's not connected to anything, and some short period of time later it's mostly business as usual again, and things haven't changed inside the organization. Like, the climate there is still exclusive. In other words, people are being excluded, or it's still harmful in various ways to people of color. That's what makes something performative. On the other hand, I like for everybody who's starting out as an anti-racist to feel good about the first steps that they're taking, and to know that those are only first steps towards creating a new culture. I think that you, Alison, have also studied somebody that I've studied, who's Resmaa Menakem. Am I right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And he's an author that, like, I'm just totally channeling in the best way I can, which is not enough. What he has to say about the fact that, yeah, we need a whole new culture. White people need to do culture building among themselves as to what the world is going to be post-racism and post-whiteness. Like, how can we be part of building a new culture? So that's all I'll say about that. But nothing that you do is performative if it's connected to that, if it's part of your journey of doing that.
Thank you, Laura. I think that's important. And I think also recognizing that this is a journey, this is a long-term process. And I'm seeing a lot of comments here that are really helpful, because they're holding our feet to the fire. They're looking for accountability. They're looking for detailed action plans. And that's exactly what we're hoping to produce, right? And bringing all of these folks together. I'm doing a bit of what happens next, right? And having this platform where we can bring people together, create trusts between brands, retailers, all of our partners, get this information about where people are now, what are your diversity stats, right? And if they are 0, then how can we ensure a year from now there's a certain percentage of growth, right? So I just want to validate, normalize, and say that I am right there with folks who are saying, what are you going to do about it, right? And where is that accountability piece? I just want to, we've got 4 minutes. I'm going to say a bit more about what's next, but Lee, if you have final words, and no pressure, but final words to share either about your journey or about HOCA, or just, you know, in being here today, what it was like for you.
Yeah, well, one, I'm deeply humbled to be invited. I think this topic is so, you know, it goes back to the original question. It's so personal it should be personal for all of us. I mean, I think if there's anything I can convey is this isn't about who I work for, or, you know, it's about a personal understanding and acceptance and vulnerability and all these things that come with it. You know, hold yourself personally accountable. It will influence how you conduct your day, your work day, your business, et cetera. And then, yeah, as a leader within a brand, I'm insanely motivated to be a change maker. And I've borrowed that term from our director of creative and communications, Martha Garcia. But yeah, but it's you know, something that, you know, we talk a lot about. Like we have to be intentional. We have to think through why we're doing things. Is, you know, from everything from who's behind the camera to who's in front of the camera, who's working within the team, and who are we trying to reach? You know, you have to look at every aspect of it. And I know Deckers will be coming out, you know, sometime soon around metrics, and, you know, that is, you know, being part of a publicly traded company, that is more on Deckers to communicate than myself. But it is something we're talking about. It is something we're going to hold ourselves accountable to. And I think that's where the personal accountability, it starts there, because it does influence your business decisions. It absolutely does. And if you try to separate the two, you will fail. And it's why we're in this situation to begin with. So that's my parting words, and, you know, really happy to be part of this journey with everyone and being part of the change. And I'm going to screw up just like anyone else will screw up, but acknowledge it, move on, do better.
Thank you. That was a really key piece there. The fact that all of us are going to make mistakes, myself included. I think I know a lot, but what I really know is that I don't know a lot.
I don't know much.
Our next step. So this was an amazing conversation. We could honestly talk all day, but we're not going to leave it here. You will receive an email at the end of this week for follow-up small group discussions. I'm calling them stretch sessions, where we're going to get uncomfortable. So we will have at least 3 or 4 of these opportunities for smaller groups of, let's say, 25 folks to get together and have these conversations, share best practices, ask questions, dig deeper. So please stay tuned on that. As I mentioned, if you are not yet a partner, please register at runningdiversity.com. And look, our work, we're only 3 weeks in at this point. It's an ultra marathon with no medals, lots of questions to ask and answer, and accountability really is the name of the game. But thank you everybody for joining. 280 folks. Thank you for your transparency, for your bravery. And this will be available recorded after the fact. So thank you all very, very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Lee, Laura, Alison, and everybody for being part of this.
Yes.